The sun was trying to kill everything that afternoon. It pressed down on the flat's outside mineral fork like a hand on a man's neck, flat, merciless, personal. The alkali dust rose in pale curtains off the hardpan, and the scrub cedar along the ridge line had gone the color of old bone. Nothing moved. Not even the crows. Elias Cord stood at the edge of his porch with a tin cup of coffee gone cold, watching the road. He was 71 years old, and he looked every year of it, the deep-cut lines around his mouth, the white stubble that came in uneven where an old scar ran along his jaw. The slight hitch in his left hip that flared when weather changed. His hands, though. His hands were still the hands of the man he'd once been. Wide. Steady. Capable of a patience that younger men misread as slowness. He saw the wagon before he heard it. It crested the cedar ridge at a tilt, one wheel wobbling on a bent axle, the mule pulling with the grim resignation of a creature that had stopped expecting anything good. Dust followed it in a low brown wave. He set the cup down on the rail without looking at it. There were shapes on the wagon bench. A woman and 2 children. The woman held the reins with both hands, leaning slightly forward, the way people lean when they've been riding too long and the destination is all that's keeping them upright. Elias descended the porch steps slowly, 3 of them, his boots finding each board with deliberate care. He walked out to the edge of the yard and stood there, arms loose at his sides. When the wagon rolled to a stop, the boy on the bench, maybe 8 years old, stared down at him with the flat, empty eyes of a child who had seen things that hollowed a person out. The girl beside him was younger, 5 or 6, and she pressed her face against the woman's arm without making a sound. The woman looked at Elias. Her face was sunburned and dirt-streaked and very tired. "My husband was Jonas Fennick," she said. "He told me, if anything ever happened, I was to come here." Elias looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the children. Then he looked at the road behind them, reading it the way he'd always read roads, for what followed. "Come down off that wagon," he said quietly. "I'll put the mule up." If this story already has you feeling something, hit that subscribe button right now and ring that bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now, settle in, because this one is going to stay with you. Her name was Clara Fennick, and she had been on the road for 11 days. Elias learned this in pieces, the way you learn things about a person who has gone too long without speaking, not in full sentences, but in fragments offered during the work of settling in. She said it while he unhitched the mule. She said it while she lifted the girl down from the wagon bench. She said it while she stood in the yard with her arms at her sides, looking at the house as if she were deciding something. Or had already decided and was giving herself a moment to grieve the other choice. The house was not a welcoming thing to look at from the outside. Elias had lived alone for 9 years, and the place showed it. The whitewash had peeled off the south wall in long strips, and the front window had a crack across it sealed with a strip of oilcloth. The porch railing on the left side listed outward at a careless angle. The yard was swept clean, that much was true. Elias was a man who swept, but the flower beds his wife Marin had dug along the fence line had gone to dry weed and gravel. Clara stood at the porch steps and pressed her lips together. Said nothing. Inside was better in some ways and worse in others. The floor was swept. The furniture was sparse and practical, a table, 4 chairs, a cast-iron stove, a shelf of provisions. But it held the cold smell of a place where no one cooked much, where no one burned candles for pleasure. Where the windows had not been opened in long enough that the air inside tasted faintly of dust and of a man who lived without softness. The girl, whose name was Rose, stepped inside and immediately went to the corner near the stove and sat down on the floor. She pulled her knees to her chest. She did not cry. She just watched. The boy, Thomas, stood in the doorway with his arms crossed. He had his father's name, Elias figured, the way he held the doorframe, the way he assessed the room before he walked into it. Jonas had done that. Jonas had been 26 the last time Elias saw him, already a man with a man's careful habits. Jonas Fennick had ridden with Elias for 3 years along the Texas-New Mexico border, carrying the law when the law was still just a notion held together by the men willing to die for it. He'd been a good man. More than good. He had been the kind of man who remembered what you told him once and never needed to be told again. Elias had heard about his death from a passing freighter 4 months back. Shot in his own yard by a man named Deacon Pruitt over a water rights dispute. Shot 3 times, and still crawled to the barn to close the stall gate so his horse wouldn't get loose. That was Jonah's. Even dying, he thought of the horse. "I'll make supper," Clara said. She was already moving toward the provision shelf, already taking inventory with her eyes. "You've been traveling 11 days, Elias said. That doesn't change the children being hungry." She said it without sharpness. It was just a fact, flat and plain. She lifted a sack of cornmeal from the shelf and set it on the table. Elias stood there for a moment. Then he went to the back pantry and came out with a smoked ham hock he'd been saving for no particular occasion, a string of dried onions, 3 potatoes, and a jar of pepper he kept on the high shelf where he rarely bothered to reach. He set them on the table beside the cornmeal without a word. Clara looked at the ham hock. Something moved across her face. "Thank you," she said. "Jonah's brought me a bottle of decent whiskey every Christmas for 3 years straight," Elias said. "Figured I owed him something back." They worked the kitchen together, not speaking much, learning each other's movements the way people do when they are both practical and careful. Clara had the ham hock in a pot with the onions and 2 of the potatoes within 20 minutes. The rich smell of it beginning to fill the room and push out the cold museum smell that had lived there too long. Elias mixed the cornmeal into Johnny cakes on the iron skillet, adding a spoonful of bacon grease from the tin beside the stove, doing it by feel and memory, the way Marin had shown him. Rose came out from her corner when the smell reached her. She sat at the table without being asked, folding her small hands in front of her. Thomas came in from the doorway and sat down across from his sister, still with his arms crossed, still watching Elias with that measuring, careful look. "What do you want?" Thomas said. Elias set a Johnny cake on the boy's plate. "For you to eat something. I mean from us. Nobody does something for nothing." Clara looked up from the stove. "Thomas." "It's an honest question," Elias said. He pulled out the chair at the head of the table and lowered himself into it with the slow deliberateness of a man whose body required negotiation. "And you're right. Nobody does something for nothing. Your father did something for me once, a long time ago, that I can't repay him for because he's gone. So I'm paying it forward. That makes sense to you." Thomas thought about this. He unfolded his arms. "What did he do?" "He pulled me out of a river when I was too stubborn to admit the current was stronger than I was." Elias paused. "I was 62 years old, and I nearly drowned myself because I was too proud to swim diagonal. Your father came in after me without a word. Got me to the bank. Then sat down and didn't say a single thing about it, which was the kindest thing a man ever did for my pride." A long silence. Then Thomas picked up the Johnny cake and took a bite. Rose was already eating, small and precise, holding her spoon with both hands. They ate the ham and onion soup with the Johnny cakes, and Elias went and found a jar of sourwood honey he kept in the back of the pantry and set it on the table. And Rose's eyes went wide and solemn as a churchgoer's at the sight of it. Clara put her hand over her mouth for a moment, just briefly, and then she composed herself and began to eat. The kitchen was warm. Outside, the last of the afternoon light came through the cracked window in a long slant the color of hammered brass, and it caught the steam rising from the pot, and for a little while. The house smelled like something it hadn't smelled like in years. Like people. Like a meal cooked with intention. Like a place someone was living in, rather than simply waiting in. Elias ate slowly and said very little. That night, after Clara had put the children in the back room on the cornhusk mattress and come back to bank the stove for the night, she stood in the doorway of the kitchen and looked at Elias where he sat in his chair by the window. "I don't know how long we'll need to stay," she said. "You'll know when you know," he said. "Until then, this is where you are." Morning came cold, the way it does in high desert country when the night has pulled every degree of warmth back down into the earth. Elias was up before the light, which was his habit and had been for 50 years, the remnant of a life that required being awake before anything else was. He had a fire going in the stove and the coffee on before he heard Thomas's feet on the floor. The boy appeared in the kitchen doorway still wearing his clothes from the day before, boots in his hand, hair standing at a confused angle. Elias poured a second cup and set it on the table. He did not say anything about the boy's age or whether coffee was appropriate for him. He just set it there. Thomas sat down. He looked at the cup. He picked it up and drank from it with the seriousness of a man at a business meeting. "What needs doing?" the boy said. "Fence on the east pasture's got 3 posts heeled over from last month's wind. Mule needs water and grain. Woodpile's getting short." Thomas nodded like he was taking inventory. "I'll show you the fence first," Elias said. They went out into the blue-gray early light together, the old man and the boy, and spent the first hour at the east pasture with a post driver and a shovel. Thomas was not large, but he worked without complaint and without the need for constant instruction, which Elias noticed and valued without remarking on it. When a post came loose and nearly struck Elias's bad hip, Thomas was already moving to stabilize it before Elias could call out. "You've worked fence before," Elias said. "Pa had 40 acres in the Concho River country. We all worked it. Good country, Concho River." Thomas said, and drove the post driver down hard. Elias let the silence stand. By mid-morning, Rose had appeared at the pasture fence with a tin pail. Clara had sent her with cold coffee and 2 biscuits she'd made from scratch while they worked. Finding flour and lard and instinctively knowing where things lived in the kitchen the way women who have run a house understand a kitchen from first principles. Rose walked the fence line carefully, the pail held level with both hands, her small boots finding the dry ground with grave precision. Elias crouched down when she reached him, taking the pail. She looked at him very directly. She had dark eyes, serious and observant, set in a round face still carrying the last trace of baby softness. "Mama says don't let it get cold," she said. "Yes, Elias said." Rose considered this. "You're very old," she said. "I am." "Are you going to die soon?" "Rose." Thomas's voice came sharp. "It's an honest question," Elias said, echoing the boy's words from the night before, and he saw the corner of Thomas's mouth shift. "Probably not today," Elias told her. "I've got a fence to fix." Rose nodded, satisfied. She turned and walked back toward the house with the same grave precision. Thomas watched her go. She asked the undertaker in Brackettville the same thing. Right to his face. What did he say? He said everyone dies sooner or later. Thomas paused. She told him that wasn't an answer. Elias drank the coffee. She's right. It isn't. 40 miles to the southwest, in a town called Cutter's Crossing where the saloon stayed open on Sundays because the preacher had given up. A man named Deacon Pruitt sat at a corner table with a glass of rye and a map spread before him. Pruitt was not a large man. He was narrow-shouldered and thin-fingered and carried himself with the precise, dry economy of a man who had learned that size was less useful than patience. He had a round-brimmed hat and pale grey eyes that moved slowly across things the way a bookkeepers do, measuring, recording, calculating. Beside him sat a man named Cull Mabry, who was large and did not think much about things, which made him useful. "Phoenix woman left Brackettville 11 days back," Pruitt said. He drew his finger along the map to a thin line that represented the old Cedar Ridge Road. "She's got papers. Jonas filed a water claim with the county 2 weeks before I killed him, and his woman's got the filing receipt." Cull looked at the map. "So we find the woman." "We find the woman," Pruitt confirmed. "She's got a name she might run to. Old lawman. Cord. Elias Cord. He used to ride the border with Fenwick." He tapped the map at a small notation north of the Cedar Ridge. "Had a place out on the Mineral Fork Flats. Cord. Cull repeated the name without interest. You know him. Heard of him. Old man. Retired years back. Pruitt folded the map with the care of a man handling a letter of credit. Old doesn't mean nothing, he said. But it does mean slower. He took a sip of rye. Give it a few days. Let her settle. Then we'll go see about those papers. Mineral Fork was the kind of town that had intended to be larger than it became. There were gaps between the storefronts where buildings had been planned and never built, and the main street was wide enough for 2 wagon teams to pass but saw only one at a time on most days. It had a dry goods, a feed store, a barber shop, a post office, and a saloon called the Quarry House that was the center of the town's intellectual life, such as it was. Elias went to town every week on Thursday. This Thursday, he took Clara and the children. The wagon ride in was an hour and a quarter on the flat road, the mule going at its own pace, the sky overhead a hard, aching blue with no cloud to soften it. Rose sat in the wagon bed with her legs folded and watched the landscape go past. Thomas sat beside Elias on the bench. Clara sat on Thomas's other side, her hands in her lap, her good dress, faded blue calico, well mended, brushing against the boy's sleeve. Elias had not thought about how the town would receive them until they were already pulling down the main street and he saw Mrs. Holt come out of the dry goods to stand under the awning with her arms crossed and that particular expression she wore when she was filing information for later distribution. Nadine Holt was the wife of the county land assessor and the chief conveyor of news in Mineral Fork. She was 60, built like a cedar post, and possessed of the absolute conviction that the social fabric of any community depended on the diligence of a few good women who were willing to keep track of everything. Elias pulled up in front of the dry goods and set the brake. Clara climbed down with a composure that came from practice, from years of entering rooms where she was being assessed and choosing not to acknowledge the assessment. Elias called, Mrs. Holt said. I didn't know you were expecting company. I wasn't, Elias said. This is Clara Fennick. And Thomas and Rose. They'll be staying at the property for a time. Mrs. Holt's eyes moved across Clara with the thoroughness of a customs inspector. Fennick, she said. Any relation to the Fennick that used to work the Concho River country? My husband, Clara said. Her voice was pleasant and completely unreadable. And your husband would be where now? Dead, Clara said, with the same pleasantness. Mrs. Holt absorbed this. Well, I'm sorry for your loss. She did not sound especially sorry. She sounded interested. And you're staying with Elias Cord. We're staying at his property, Clara said. That's what I said. No, Clara said, with a small, precise smile. It isn't. Elias was already moving toward the door of the dry goods. He had a list in his breast pocket, coffee, salt, a bolt of muslin, lamp oil, and he was not interested in the conversation on the boardwalk. He had learned decades ago that engaging with the Nadine Holts of the world was like arguing with weather. You didn't win. You just got wet. Inside, Emmett Fry stood behind the counter. He was a decent man, Fry, one of the ones Elias trusted with minimal reservation. He filled the list without comment and was wrapping the muslin in paper when the door opened and Sheriff Cade Allred came in. Allred was 40, heavyset, with a drooping brown mustache and a badge that had gone slightly tarnished. He was not a dishonest man, but he was an easily influenced one, which in a small town amounted to nearly the same thing. Elias, he said. He nodded at the wrapped supplies. Heard you had some people come in. Word moves fast. It's a small town. Allred picked up a paper of horehound candy from the jar on the counter, turning it in his fingers without buying it. People are talking. People always are. They're saying you've got a widow woman and 2 children living in your house. That's accurate. Allred set the candy down. Elias. You know how things look. You know how people, I know exactly how people think, Elias said. He turned to face the sheriff fully, and something in the quality of his attention, something old and still and absolute, caused all red to stop talking. She's the widow of the best man I rode within 30 years of keeping order along the Texas border. She's got 2 children, no money, and a dead husband who was killed by a man named Deacon Pruitt over a water claim. She needed a place to land. I had a place. He picked up his wrapped supplies. If the town has a problem with Christian charity, the town is welcome to take that up with God. He walked out. On the boardwalk, Clara was still standing with Mrs. Holt, who had been joined by 2 other women. Thomas stood slightly apart, watching the street with his arms crossed. Rose was looking at the penny candy jars visible through the window of the dry goods. Elias came out and handed the wrapped supplies to Thomas. Then he went back inside, spent 2 cents, and came out with a small paper twist of lemon drops. He held them out to Rose without comment. Rose accepted them with both hands. Clara saw this. She said nothing, but the line of her shoulders changed, some small increment of tightness releasing itself. Mrs. Holt was saying something about arrangements and propriety and the impression it created for the children. Clara listened to all of it and then said, simply, "You're very kind to be concerned," and turned to help Thomas load the supplies into the wagon. And the subject was closed as far as she was concerned. Driving home, Thomas said, "Is there going to be trouble with the town?" Elias watched the road. "Some talk. It'll pass." "And the other kind?" Elias glanced at the boy. 8 years old, and already parsing the difference between social difficulty and the kind that carried a gun. He thought of Deacon Pruitt. He thought of the way Clara had looked behind them every mile of the ride in, just briefly, just once, the way a person looks who has been followed before. "Might be," he said. "What do we do?" Elias kept his eyes on the road. "We don't wait for it to come find us standing still," he said. He moved the rifles that night. He did it quietly, while Clara was settling the children, taking the Winchester down from the wall rack and leaning it inside the back bedroom door, within Clara's reach. The old sharps he placed under the table in the kitchen where he'd know exactly where it was in the dark. And the 2 Colts, the ones he'd carried for so long they felt like extensions of his hands rather than tools, he cleaned and loaded at the kitchen table with the lamp turned low. Working by feel and long memory, the oil and metal smell of it familiar and solemn. Clara came back in and stopped when she saw him. "You're expecting someone," she said. "Preparing for the possibility." She sat down across from him. She watched his hands work the cylinder check with the unhurried precision of a man who had done it 10,000 times. "Deacon Pruitt," she said. "He'll have found out by now where we went." "Probably. Jonas told me about him. Said he was the patient kind. Patient men are the ones worth worrying about." Elias set the second Colt down and looked at her. "You said Jonas filed a water claim before he died." 2 weeks before. He knew Pruitt was building toward something. He wanted it on record. She folded her hands on the table. "I have the filing receipt. In the lining of my bag." "Good. That's what he wants. He can't file a counterclaim without disputing Jonas's claim first, and he can't do that without the original filing number." She had thought this through. She had had 11 days on a wagon to think it through. If he gets the receipt, he burns it, files his own claim. The land office in Brackettville will never know there was a prior filing. Elias nodded slowly. "He doesn't just want you gone. He wants the paper." "Yes." A moth was beating itself against the lamp glass, soft rhythmic thuds, persistent and futile. Elias watched it for a moment. "Sleep," he said. "I'll sit up." "I can, Clara." He said her name with a gentleness that did not argue. "Sleep." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she went. The house went quiet. Outside, the desert night was enormous and still, the kind of still that has a weight to it. That presses against window glass and makes the ears work harder to separate the sound of wind from the sound of something else. It was past 2 in the morning when the dog at the barn, a short-legged cattle dog named Drum who had not been mentioned yet because he lived his life with a quiet sufficiency that required no introduction, began to growl. Not bark. Growl. The low, internal, continuous kind that meant something was already close. Elias was out of the chair before the sound fully registered, the Colt in his right hand, moving to the window without lighting anything new. He pressed himself to the side of the frame and looked out. Moonlight on the yard. Pale and flat, the shadows hard-edged. The barn door was still closed. Nothing in the open yard. But Drum was still growling, and Drum was a dog of precise vocabulary. Elias moved to the back door, easing it open on well-oiled hinges. He had oiled them 2 days before, and not by accident. He stepped out onto the back porch in his socks, the board under his foot cold and faintly damp. The figure was at the fence line of the east pasture, the fence he and Thomas had repaired. A man, standing still, facing the house. Not moving. Just standing there, in the way that is more unsettling than any other approach, the patient, watching stillness of a man taking inventory. Another shape, just at the edge of the cedar shadow to the left. Larger. That would be Cull Mabry, if Elias's reading of things was right. He descended the porch steps without sound. He had learned in 40 years of law work that silence was its own kind of authority. He covered 30 feet of yard before the man at the fence noticed him, and by then Elias was close enough that the moonlight found both Colts, the second one he'd drawn without thinking about it. Pure reflex, purely the body's long-practiced knowledge of what the moment required. The man at the fence was not Pruitt. It was a younger man, maybe 30, with a thin beard and the blank, hired expression of someone who was being paid not to think. He had a gun on his hip and his hand near it, but he had not drawn, because there had not been time. And now there was an old man 10 feet in front of him with 2 revolvers and a quality of stillness that was much worse than aggression. "You're too old to be carrying a gun," the man said. His voice came out with an attempted lightness that didn't quite hold. Elias looked at him. "That's why I carry 2, he said. The silence after that had a texture to it, like river clay, dense and yielding nothing. From the cedar shadow, Cull Mabry had not moved. Elias addressed the darkness without looking away from the first man. "The big one in the trees," he said, loud enough to carry. "You're welcome to try something. I'll finish with your friend here first and then address you. Or you can walk back to whatever you came in on and tell Deacon Pruitt that Elias Cord says hello and that the filing receipt is already in the hands of the county recorder's office in Mineral Fork. Along with a sworn statement about Jonas Fenwick's murder. Tell him that's what happens when a man has 11 days on a wagon to think. It wasn't true. Not yet. But it would be." The decision crystallized in him as he said it, clean and absolute, the way decisions do when a man stops weighing and simply knows. The man at the fence stepped back. You were just leaving," Elias said. "They left." He stood in the yard until he heard the horses on the far side of the cedar ridge, moving away, heading southwest. Then he stood a while longer, because that was the habit of a man who had learned not to trust the first silence after a threat. Drum came out from the barn and sat beside him, still unprofessional, looking in the same direction. "Good dog," Elias said. He went back inside. He did not sleep. He sat in his chair with the Colts on the table and watched the window go from black to grey to the first painful blue of morning, and he thought about Jonas, and about water rights. And about what a man still owed to a world that had given him enough years to get tired but not enough to stop caring. Clara appeared at 5, already dressed. She looked at him. She looked at the Colts on the table. She went to the stove and put the coffee on without a word. When she set the cup in front of him, her hand rested on his for a moment. "Just a moment. I'll get the bag," she said. He drove to Mineral Fork alone the next morning, the filing receipt in his breast pocket beside the cold coffee tin he sometimes carried and never remembered to drink from. He left at first light, before the children were awake, leaving Clara with the Winchester and a clear field of view from the kitchen window, and Drum at the yard's edge. and Thomas, who slept the watchful half-sleep of a boy becoming a man faster than was fair. The county recorder's office didn't open until 8. Elias sat outside it on a bench in the spare morning shade and drank the cold coffee and watched the town come to life. The gradual unlocking and sweeping out and opening of shutters that constitutes a small town's daily resurrection. Emmett Fry from the dry goods crossed the street and nodded. "Early, Elias. Got business? Everything all right out at your place?" "Getting there." Fry paused. He was a man who thought before he spoke, which made him rarer than he knew. "I heard some things from Nadine last night. About that woman and her children." Elias looked at him. "I think what you're doing is right," Fry said. "For whatever it's worth from a dry goods man." "Worth more than you'd think," Elias said. When the recorder's office opened, Elias sat across the desk from a young man named Bertrand Alcott who had ink on his fingers and the sincere, methodical manner of someone who genuinely believed that paperwork was civilization's most important product. Elias respected that. He laid the filing receipt on the desk and explained Jonas Fenwick's water claim and the circumstances of his death, and Alcott listened and made notes and asked careful questions. "You're saying this man Pruitt killed the claimant before the claim could be contested through proper channels," Alcott said. "Killed him in his own yard in front of his children," Elias said. 3 shots. Alcott wrote this down with the same precise care he'd have given a routine property description. "And the widow is the legal heir to the claim." "She is. We'll need to register the inheritance formally. There's a process, a death affidavit, a claim transfer form." Alcott was already reaching for the right forms, pulling them from a drawer with the efficiency of a man who knew where everything lived. "It will take a week to process. Maybe 10 days. Once it's registered in Mrs. Fenwick's name, any counterclaim Pruitt files will be automatically flagged as a dispute against a registered claim. He'll have to appear before a judge." Alcott looked up. "In person? In court? On the record?" "That's what I'm counting on," Elias said. He spent an hour in that office, signing his own name as a witness to the account of Jonas Fenwick's killing, and a second hour with the county sheriff, a different one from all red. The county-level law, a man named Beaumont who had the relaxed authority of someone not running for anything. Elias gave him Pruitt's name, the names of the men who had come to the property the night before, and a clear account of the water rights dispute. Beaumont listened and wrote and nodded and asked about witnesses, and Elias gave him Clara's name and told him Thomas could account for what he'd seen in the yard the day his father was killed. "We'll send a wire to the Brackettville sheriff," Beaumont said. "See what they've got on Pruitt. If he's done this kind of thing before, he has," Elias said. "Water's short in the Concho country. He's been running people off their claims for 2 years. Then he's made enemies, and enemies talk." Beaumont tapped his pen on the desk. "Give us 10 days, Mr. Cord." Walking back to the wagon, Elias passed Mrs. Holt on the boardwalk. She was standing with purpose, as she often was, in the manner of a woman who treats her own presence as a civic function. "I heard you were at the recorder's office," she said. "You heard correctly. About that woman's land claim. About Jonas Fenwick's legal water right, which now belongs to his widow and his children." He said it without heat, without invitation for further discussion, with the flat finality of a closing argument. "If you want to talk about something worth talking about, Nadine, talk about a man who killed a settler in front of his family and then sent men to a widow's new address in the middle of the night. Talk about that." He did not wait for her response. But she talked about it. He'd known she would. By evening, the Holt assessment had shifted, because Nadine Holt was not a cruel woman, she was a small-town woman with a small-town woman's tools. And when the story reorganized itself in her understanding, she reorganized herself accordingly. By the following Sunday, the account of what Deacon Pruitt had done to the Fenwick family had circulated through Mineral Fork with the thorough efficiency of church gossip. And the town's position on Clara Fenwick and her children had undergone the quiet, collective revision that small communities are capable of when given a properly dramatic narrative to replace the one they'd been working with. Mrs. Holt came out to the property on Thursday. She brought an apple pie and a bolt of oilcloth for the cracked window. And she sat at the kitchen table and talked with Clara for 2 hours about practical things, the school situation for Thomas, the church's auxiliary fund for families in hardship, the nearest doctor and what he charged. Clara accepted all of it with the same pleasant composure she'd shown on the boardwalk, except this time the composure had something warmer underneath it. Thomas started at the Mineral Fork schoolhouse the following Monday. Rose started Wednesday. She told the schoolmistress on the first morning that she thought the schoolroom smelled like chalk and old thinking, which Elias considered an accurate assessment. The legal process did not conclude dramatically, which suited Elias. Drama was for men with something to prove. The water claim was registered in Clara Fenwick's name on a Wednesday morning in mid-October, and the notice went out to the county of record in Bracketville as required by law. And when Deacon Pruitt showed up at the land office in Bracketville to file his counter-claim, he found himself in the company of a county sheriff who had received a wire from Mineral Fork and another from 3 other counties who had been waiting for Pruitt to slow down enough to be caught. Pruitt was not a large man and he was not a violent one on his own terms. He was the kind of man who hired violence and arranged it from a table with a glass of rye. Without Cull Mabry, who had thought better of his employment situation after the night in the Cedar Shadow, Pruitt had nobody between himself and the law. He went quietly, in the manner of men who have always believed that patience and cleverness would eventually outrun consequence and discover, usually only once, that they are mistaken. The land was Clara's. Elias got the news from Beaumont by way of a short wire, 7 words, Pruitt in custody. Claim clear. Good work, Cord. He read it at the kitchen table and set it down and drank his coffee. Clara was frying salt pork. Rose was at the table drawing horses on the back of an old bill of sale, her tongue tucked between her teeth in concentration. Thomas was outside splitting wood. He had been splitting wood every morning for 2 weeks, and the stack against the south wall had grown to a height that would carry them through 2 hard winters. Because Thomas was a boy who did not do things halfway. The axe came down in a steady rhythm, clean and regular as a clock. Elias folded the wire and put it in his breast pocket. Word from Beaumont, he said. Clara set the fork down. Turned from the stove. Pruitt's in custody, Elias said. Claims clear. The room was quiet for a moment. Rose stopped drawing. She looked up at Clara, reading her mother the way children read the most important faces in their lives, completely and without pretense. Clara's eyes were bright. She pressed her lips together and breathed once through her nose. I need to go see the land, she said. When things are settled. I need to go see it. That's right, Elias said. Will you come? He thought about the Concho River country. He thought about 40 acres and a water claim and Jonas Fenwick closing a stall gate while he was dying because the horse shouldn't get loose. He thought about what it meant to have a thing worth keeping and the people willing to fight for it. Yes, he said. I'll come. Rose went back to her horses. Outside, the axe found its rhythm again, clean and unhurried. There is a thing that happens to a man, or a house, or a piece of land, when it has been empty long enough. The emptiness becomes familiar. It begins to feel like permanence, like character, like something that was always meant to be. A man can mistake loneliness for peace, and a house can mistake silence for completion. What happened at Elias Cord's place on the Mineral Fork Flats was not a miracle. It was smaller and therefore more real than that. It was a pot of ham soup filling a room that had forgotten what food cooked with intention smelled like. It was a boy's arms uncrossing, slowly. It was a little girl asking an old man if he was going to die soon, and the old man finding, with some surprise, that he had reasons to say not today. It was a man who had carried guns long enough that they were part of his hands, standing in moonlight in his socks with the unshakable purpose of someone who had found, at the far end of his life, that there was still something worth standing in front of. Broken places grow back stronger at the breaks. Not because the break heals clean, but because the healing calls on every resource the living thing has, roots, reach, light-seeking. The deep and patient desire to be more than what the wound made you. Elias Cord was 71 years old and had been empty for 9 years. He was, by October, considerably less empty than that. And on the south wall, the woodpile was high enough to last 2 winters. Which was, all things considered, a good place to begin.